My sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbours because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Jo Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Jo Gargery marry her by hand. Jo was a fair man, with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such very undecided blue that it seemed to have somehow got mixed up with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Jo, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron, fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops, and having a square, impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself and a strong reproach against Jo that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it at all, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. Jo's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of the dwellings in our country were, most of them at that time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up and Jo was sitting alone in the kitchen. Jo and I being fellow sufferers, and having confidences as such, Jo imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in at him opposite to it, sitting in the chimney corner. Mrs. Jo has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now, making it a baker's dozen. Is she? Yes, Pip, said Jo, and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her. At this dismal intelligence, I twisted the only button on my waistcoat round and round, and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. She sat down, said Jo, and she got up, and she made a grab at Tickler, and she rampaged out. That's what she did, said Jo, slowly clearing the fire between the lower bars with the poker, and looking at it. She rampaged out, Pip. Has she been gone long, Jo? I always treated him as a larger species of child, and as no more than my equal. Well, said Jo, glancing up at the Dutch clock. She's been on the rampage this last spell about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-coming. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack towel betwixt you. I took the advice. My sister, Mrs. Jo, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied the Tickler to its further investigation. She concluded by throwing me. I often served her as a connubial missile at Jo, who, glad to get hold of me on any terms, passed me on into the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. Where have you been, you young monkey? Said Mrs. Jo, stamping her foot. Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worry, or I'd have you out of that corner if you was 50 pips and he was 500 Gargeries. I've only been to the churchyard, said I, from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. Churchyard, repeated my sister. If it weren't for me, you'd have been to that churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand? You did, said I. And why did I do it, I should like to know, exclaimed my sister. I whimpered, I don't know. I don't know, said my sister. I'd never do it again, I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since you were born. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife and him a gougery without being your mother. My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked disconsolately at the fire, for the fugitive out on the marshes with the ironed leg, the mysterious young man, the file, the food, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises rose before me in the avenging coals. "Ha!" said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. "Churchyard indeed. You may well say churchyard, you two. One of us, by the by, had not said it at all. You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you, one of these days, and oh, precious pair you'd be without me." As she applied herself to set the tea things, Joe peeped down at me over his leg, as if he were mentally casting me and himself up. And calculating what kind of pair we practically should make under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. After that, he sat feeling his right side flaxen curls and whiskers and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, as his manner always was at squally times. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it and sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on the loaf in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster. Using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity, she trimming and moulding the butter off round the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaister and sawed it very thick, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into two halves, of which Joe got one and I the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance and his ally, a still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water. And it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers, and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was in our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me, by the display of his fast diminishing slice, to enter upon our usual friendly competition, but he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last, I desperately considered that thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg.